The panic started when someone screamed "Fire" during the headliner's set at Madison Square Garden, and suddenly 20,000 fans were rushing toward exits that couldn't handle the crowd. While other security personnel were being trampled in the chaos, the event security supervisor moved through the stampede with tactical precision that belonged in a riot zone, revealing he wasn't just checking tickets. He was a former military police officer whose crowd control training had prepared him for exactly this mass casualty situation. For 7 years, Daniel Park had been the invisible force that kept major concerts safe. As head of security for Premier Event Management, he'd overseen crowd control for everything from rock concerts to political rallies, ensuring that thousands of people could gather safely in venues across the country. To the staff and performers, he was simply Dan, the professional security supervisor who somehow made complex crowd dynamics look effortless. What they didn't know was that Daniel carried credentials that would have surprised the entire entertainment industry. Hidden in his apartment was an Army discharge certificate documenting 8 years with the Military Police Corps, including specialized training in riot control and crowd management. The same eyes that now scanned for potential troublemakers had once maintained order during civil unrest in Iraq, where crowd control meant the difference between peaceful resolution and deadly violence. Those 8 years had taken Daniel through some of the most challenging situations in military law enforcement. Military police officers were specialists in crowd control, civil disorder response, and maintaining order in high-stress environments. Daniel had managed riots in Baghdad, controlled crowds during humanitarian aid distribution, and learned to read group psychology in situations where mass panic could turn deadly in seconds. The transition from military police to event security hadn't been difficult. The skills were remarkably similar. Both jobs required the ability to read crowd dynamics, anticipate problems before they escalated, and maintain order among large groups of people whose emotions could change rapidly. The main difference was that concert crowds were generally celebrating rather than protesting, but Daniel knew that celebration could turn to panic just as quickly as peaceful demonstrations could become violent riots. Madison Square Garden was one of the most challenging venues in Daniel's portfolio. With a capacity of 20,000 people packed into a relatively small space, crowd management required constant vigilance and precise coordination between security teams. The venue's multiple levels, limited exit capacity, and passionate fan base created conditions that could become dangerous if not properly managed. Tonight's concert featured a popular rock band with a reputation for energetic performances that inspired intense crowd responses. Daniel had reviewed the band's previous shows, studied video footage of their fan interactions, and positioned his security team based on patterns he'd observed during similar high-energy events. What concerned Daniel wasn't the band's performance. It was the venue's crowd density. With 20,000 tickets sold for a venue that could theoretically hold that many people, the actual available space was reduced by stage equipment, security barriers, and emergency protocols. Daniel's military police training had taught him that crowd disasters typically occurred when population density exceeded safe limits and something triggered mass movement toward insufficient exits. The concert began normally. The opening acts performed without incident. The crowd was energetic but manageable, and Daniel's security team maintained their positions throughout the venue. Daniel positioned himself on the main floor where he could observe crowd dynamics while remaining mobile enough to respond to emerging situations. At 9:30 p.m., the headlining band took the stage to thunderous applause. The crowd surge was immediate and expected, fans pushing forward to get closer to their favorite performers. Daniel's team had prepared for this moment, using barriers and strategic positioning to manage the forward movement without creating dangerous pressure points. But Daniel noticed something that concerned him. The crowd density near the stage was approaching what his military police training classified as critical mass, the point where individual movement becomes impossible and any disruption could trigger a stampede. Daniel activated his radio to alert his team to begin implementing what he called pressure relief, subtle crowd management techniques designed to reduce density without disrupting the concert experience. The band's performance was everything their fans had hoped for: high energy, loud music, and the kind of spectacle that created intense emotional responses. Daniel watched as the crowd's energy level continued to rise, noting the behavioral indicators that suggested people were becoming increasingly excited and less aware of their immediate surroundings. At 9:45 p.m., Daniel observed the first warning sign. A small altercation near the stage resulted in several people being pushed backward into the crowd behind them. The incident lasted only seconds, but Daniel saw how the pressure wave spread through the densely packed audience, causing people several rows back to stumble and push against those behind them. Daniel began moving toward the area where the incident had occurred, using crowd navigation techniques he'd learned during riot control training. His goal was to identify potential flashpoints and position security personnel where they could respond quickly if the situation deteriorated. At 9:47 p.m., during the band's most popular song, someone in the crowd screamed, "Fire!" The reaction was instantaneous and catastrophic. 20,000 people simultaneously tried to move toward exits that could safely handle only a fraction of that number. What had been a celebration became a life-or-death struggle as people were pushed, trampled, and crushed in the panic that followed. Daniel had seen this exact scenario during his military police training. Crowd stampedes were among the deadliest situations that law enforcement could face because they combined mass panic with physical compression that could kill people in minutes. His training had prepared him for exactly this situation, but the scale was larger than anything he'd encountered during his military service. The first priority was stopping the panic at its source. Daniel activated his emergency radio system and coordinated with the venue's sound engineer to cut the band's microphones and replace the music with calm, authoritative announcements designed to reduce panic. "This is venue security. There is no fire. Please move slowly toward the nearest exit. Do not run." But Daniel knew that verbal commands alone wouldn't stop a stampede that had already begun. He needed to implement what military police called tactical crowd control, physical interventions designed to break up dangerous crowd dynamics and create safe movement patterns. Moving through the panicking crowd, Daniel began identifying and addressing the most dangerous pressure points. Near the main exit, people were being crushed against barriers as the crowd pushed from behind. Daniel and his security team began creating what the military police called release valves, alternative routes that reduced pressure on the most dangerous choke points. The key to stopping a stampede, Daniel had learned during riot control training, was understanding crowd psychology. Panic spreads through crowds like a contagion, but it could also be interrupted by confident, authoritative leadership that gave people clear, achievable directions. Daniel positioned himself at the main exit where the crush was most severe. Using the commanding presence he developed during military law enforcement, he began directing crowd flow with the kind of authority that made people instinctively follow his instructions. "Stop pushing. Exit slowly. Help the person next to you." His military police training had taught him that people in panic situations would follow anyone who appeared to know what they were doing. Daniel used that psychology to begin converting the chaotic stampede into a controlled evacuation. Working with his security team, Daniel implemented what the military police called staged evacuation, moving people out of the venue in organized groups rather than allowing continued mass movement that could create additional pressure points. The technique required precise coordination and the ability to maintain authority during extreme stress. Daniel's military police training had included extensive work in what the Army called mass casualty management, organizing response to situations where large numbers of people were injured or at risk. He began implementing those protocols at Madison Square Garden, treating the Stampede like a combat situation where leadership and tactical thinking could save lives. His first action was establishing what military doctrine called command and control, a clear chain of authority that could coordinate multiple response teams. Daniel activated the venue's emergency management system and began directing security personnel, medical teams, and emergency responders with the precision he'd learned during military operations. The Stampede had created multiple crisis zones throughout the venue. Near the stage, people had been knocked down and were being trampled by those behind them. At the main exits, crowds were pressed against barriers with enough force to cause crushing injuries. On the upper levels, people were trying to jump over railings to reach lower-level exits. Daniel began what the military police called crisis triage, identifying the most dangerous situations and directing resources where they could save the most lives. He coordinated with his security teams using hand signals and radio communications to simultaneously address multiple emergency situations. Working with venue medical staff, Daniel established emergency treatment areas for people who had been injured in the initial panic. His military police training had included field medical protocols, and he began implementing triage procedures to identify people who needed immediate medical attention. The most challenging aspect of the response was continuing to manage crowd psychology while addressing the medical emergencies that had resulted from the Stampede. Daniel knew that if people saw the extent of the injuries, panic could resurge and create additional casualties. Using techniques learned during riot control operations, Daniel positioned his security teams to create visual barriers between injury treatment areas and the crowd that was still evacuating. The goal was to maintain calm while ensuring that injured people received necessary medical care. By 10:15 p.m., Daniel had successfully converted the chaotic Stampede into a controlled evacuation. Emergency medical services were treating injured concertgoers, the venue was being systematically cleared, and the immediate threat of additional Stampede casualties had been eliminated. When Fire Chief Rodriguez arrived to coordinate the emergency response, she found Daniel managing a complex multi-agency operation with the efficiency of someone who had been trained for exactly this situation. "How did you manage to stop a stampede and organize this response so quickly?" Chief Rodriguez asked, clearly impressed by the tactical coordination she was observing. "Military police," Daniel replied. 8 years of crowd control and riot response. Same principles, different venue.
The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of what Daniel had prevented. Crowd dynamics experts from the National Institute of Standards and Technology analyzed video footage from the Madison Square Garden Stampede and concluded that Daniel's tactical response had likely prevented what could have become one of the deadliest crowd disasters in concert history. Dr. Sarah Chen, who led the federal investigation into crowd safety, explained to Daniel that stampedes were among the most dangerous situations that could occur in large venues. Once a crowd reaches critical density and panic begins, the physics become deadly, she said. People can't control their movement, pressure builds to crushing levels, and death can occur in minutes. The video analysis showed that Daniel's intervention had broken the stampede's momentum at multiple critical points. By creating alternative exit routes, he'd reduced pressure at the main choke points. By establishing authoritative crowd control, he'd interrupted the panic psychology that was driving the dangerous behavior. By coordinating medical response, he'd ensured that people who were injured received immediate treatment. The final casualty count was remarkably low considering the scale of the incident. 23 people treated for minor injuries, mostly cuts and bruises from falling down. No fatalities, no serious crushing injuries, and no long-term medical complications. Crowd safety experts noted that stampedes of similar scale typically resulted in dozens of deaths and hundreds of serious injuries. Premier Event Management's CEO, Michael Torres, personally thanked Daniel for preventing what would have been a catastrophic loss of life and a devastating blow to the concert industry. Insurance covers equipment and property. Torres explained. "But nothing covers the kind of tragedy we avoided tonight. You saved lives and saved our industry's reputation." But perhaps the most significant recognition came from the International Association of Venue Managers, which invited Daniel to develop new crowd control protocols based on his military police training. His tactical response at Madison Square Garden became a case study for how military crowd control techniques could be adapted to civilian entertainment venues. The story spread throughout both law enforcement and entertainment industry communities as an example of how military training could find crucial application in civilian settings. Daniel's successful management of the Stampede became a model for how military police skills could be transferred to large-scale event security.
6 months later, Daniel Park was no longer just an event security supervisor. The Madison Square Garden incident had led to his appointment as Director of Crowd Safety for the International Venue Safety Association, a position that included developing crowd control protocols for entertainment venues worldwide.
Daniel created a comprehensive training program that brought military-level crowd control expertise to the entertainment industry. The curriculum included crowd psychology, stampede prevention, emergency response coordination, and what Daniel called tactical crowd management. Maintaining public safety while preserving the concert experience that people had paid to enjoy. Security personnel at venues across the country learned to recognize crowd density indicators that Daniel had first studied during military police training. They practiced stampede response scenarios, coordinated with emergency services more effectively, and developed the situational awareness that could prevent mass casualty incidents before they occurred. The program was so successful that it attracted attention from the Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, both of which began incorporating Daniel's methods into their national guidelines for large-scale event security. What had started as one veteran's career transition became a model for applying military crowd control expertise to civilian entertainment safety. Daniel's story spread throughout the veteran community as an example of how specialized military training could find meaningful application in civilian settings. Veterans who felt their crowd control and tactical skills were underutilized began to see new possibilities for service in their communities. But perhaps the most important change was in Daniel himself. During his military service, crowd control had often meant managing hostile populations during civil unrest or conflict situations. The people he was controlling were frequently angry, frightened, or actively opposing military objectives. In the entertainment industry, Daniel discovered a different kind of crowd control work. Every concert that proceeded safely, every festival that concluded without incident, every gathering where people could celebrate without fear, these were positive outcomes where his tactical skills enabled joy rather than preventing violence. During quiet moments before major events, Daniel still surveyed crowds with the same tactical awareness he'd brought to riot control operations overseas. But now he understood something that had taken him years to learn. Protecting people didn't require them to be in opposition to authority. Sometimes the most important crowd control work happened in places where nobody expected to find a former military police officer, places where stampedes were prevented before they could start, where communities could gather safely, because someone with extraordinary training chose to use those skills to protect celebration rather than suppress conflict. Daniel Park had spent 8 years managing crowds in some of the world's most dangerous situations. Now he spent his time ensuring that people could enjoy music and entertainment without fear, knowing that someone with the training and commitment to protect them was watching. And in the end, he realized both missions were exactly the same. Using specialized skills to protect people from harm, ensuring that human gatherings could proceed safely, regardless of whether those gatherings were motivated by celebration or necessity.